Until a century ago, American chestnut made up 1 in 4 trees in the eastern United States. When a blight was introduced from Asia in 1904, it came into the Bronx Zoo, some 3 or 4 billion trees were wiped out in 5 short decades. This really foretold much of what we're seeing today in so many other trees as they battle forest pests and diseases. The American Chestnut Foundation, or TACF for short, was formed to save the tree and restore what was lost. Today, this program is one of the most ambitious ecological restoration programs in the world. Our guest today is someone who is very well known to our members because she's been working for 2 decades now on chestnut research, starting chestnut orchards, compiling data, arranging grants, consulting with people on Mother Nature's challenges, and teaching young people why chestnuts are so important to our ecosystems. Sara Fitzsimmons is TACF's Director of Restoration and the Regional Science Coordinator for Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Indiana, and Ohio, quite a large territory. She has traveled to every corner of Pennsylvania and New Jersey. For Sara, really every week is Chestnut Week, not just this week. So Sara, welcome to our program at the PA Farm Show.
Thanks, Jim. You want me to go ahead and share my screen?
Go for it.
All right, excellent. And that's funny. I really do think I've been to every corner of New Jersey and Pennsylvania. I track my mileage and I travel about 25,000 miles a year just driving for work. So that's not including flying. All right, can you see my screen all right?
It's good.
No.
No?
Well, we can see you.
You can't see my screen, but you can see me? All right, let me try again. How's that?
You're good to go.
You're good to go.
All right. Okay. Thanks everybody for coming to talk about chestnut restoration. So Monday, I hope you guys were able to see Mike Alcott's overview of the chestnut research that's being done. He gave sort of an overview of the history of the American chestnut, the species, what happened to it, and then what's being done to impart disease resistance into the species. So I'm going to be talking about what it's going to take to get this species back out into the forest. One of the key features of the American Chestnut Foundation and what makes it so special as an organization and also to me is involvement of the volunteers. This is Ann and Bob Leffel. Ann passed away last year, unfortunately, but Ann and Bob with Adam Carl in the middle, he was one of our first interns for the chapter. They were the ones who brought the Pennsylvania, New Jersey chapter to its prominence in the late 90s and early 2000s. As a foundation, we log about 25,000 volunteer hours per year, and people like you do all manner of types of volunteer work. Finding trees out in the forest, I'll talk more about that a little bit later. Planting trees, of course. It's incredible to me what volunteers have done in terms of research. There's really some brilliant things that folks who are, say, salesmen or teachers or engineers, I've studied forestry my entire career, and I might be a little too, blinded by my past career and too much in a box, but you have people who come from all kinds of different perspectives that bring really fresh information and ways to look at things, who can guide novel and unique approaches to the work that we're doing. And of course, outreach and education, a lot like what we're doing with Chestnut Week, just getting information out there, teaching people about what's going on with this work, and getting people reinvigorated or invigorated by this work. We do a lot of training to involve citizen scientists, volunteers, and the public. We have actually developed training curriculum, and then as part of TACF's implementation plan, our strategic initiative, we want to try and reinvigorate that as we get more and more trees planted out. You'll see throughout this, I don't know how much this will interest you, but just in case you're curious, TACF's strategic plan And then it's imparted into an implementation plan. We have a lot of goals and objectives we want to achieve over the next 5 to 10 years. And if you look in the lower left-hand or lower right-hand part of the screen, you'll see a set of numbers. Like here it's 2.2.2.3.0. That just refers to, in our implementation plan or our strategic plan, what section of that particular area refers to. So restoration is the second part of the implementation plan. So all of these sections will have a 2 that begins them. 1 is science, 3 is promotion and outreach. And that just helps us keep organized as to what is important as a priority for the organization. One of the first things we want to be concerned about with the species is diversity. And Mike kind of touched on that a little bit on Monday, and I'm sure Bill did yesterday too, if you guys were able to catch his talk about the transgenic American chestnut. But we want to know how much diversity is in the wild American chestnut. Not only how much is there, but how much do we need to capture in a restoration or disease resistant population? How can we conserve the tree ex situ and in situ? That means either outside of its home or in its home. And then maybe we'll have some control sites where we don't do anything and just observe the species in its natural form. A common misconception about the American chestnut is that it's threatened, endangered, or even extinct. And that's not true. This is a great map that John Scrivani of the Virginia chapter put together. And this is using FIA data, forest inventory analysis data, to figure out how many trees, wild type American chestnuts, are still in the wild. You can see the dark red. There's tons of American chestnuts in the Great Smoky Mountains in Western North Carolina, through the Shenandoah Valley, those Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia and West Virginia. Pennsylvania is covered in chestnut sprouts, especially the Ridge and Valley province. It's a little bit less dense up in the northwestern corner and even the northeastern corner. Places where glaciation really scraped off a lot of the types of soil that chestnuts liked. And then again, in Massachusetts, Connecticut, there's just gobs of chestnuts all over the place. There's an estimated 430 million plus or minus trees. The problem with it is that 84% of these trees are less than 1 inch in diameter. And that leads us to call the species functionally extinct. When the trees aren't reproducing or regenerating in the wild, they aren't filling the ecological niche that they once did or really need to in the Appalachian Mountains. We have a project called the Appalachian Trail Mega Transect, where we train people to go out, hike the Appalachian Trail, give them a section of trail to count trees along there. And as part of that, we've counted 20,000 trees. Now there's way more than that along the trail, but of the sections that we've had counted, we've counted over 20,000 trees, and 0.5% of those trees were greater than 4 inches in diameter at breast height. We're using that as the cutoff to say, okay, how many trees in the native range could potentially be flowering? So if 0.5% of 430 million trees are greater than 4 inches in diameter or greater, that gives us some 2 million plus or minus trees that are actually flowering. Now, the problem with that is that you need full sunlight for a tree to flower. So surely not all of those trees that are 4 inches in diameter are flowering because they're not getting full sunlight. They may still be suppressed in the understory. You also need those trees to be within about 500 meters of each other in order for them to actually fruit. They have to pollinate one another. They can't pollinate themselves. So we use that number. There's about 2 million or so trees that are flowering. They may or may not be throwing filled fruit. That sounds like a lot, but across 180 million acres of the entire eastern US, that's actually not a lot of trees to go by. So one way that you can conserve trees is by flowering, getting chestnuts and planting them. Ex situ conservation really covers taking trees from the wild and then planting them somewhere that's not wild. So ex situ conservation would cover planting seeds. It would cover grafting. That's what you see in these pictures here. This is Jim McKenna with his grafting knife showing a graft unit on an American chestnut he did in Indiana at Purdue University. These are tissue culture boxes in the lower left-hand corner. And I always love how these things look. These are plantlets derived from chestnut embryos that are transgenic and put into tissue culture, and they look like little islands with palm trees on them. So that's very difficult to do. You can't do tissue culture right now with other types of tissue from American chestnut. It only works with immature embryos. So that there are a lot of challenges with vegetative propagation. If you think about apples, which graft really easily, or willow, where you can just take a stick and put it in the ground and you got a new tree, chestnut doesn't do that. It takes a lot of trial and effort to get them to graft. Tissue culture is difficult. You can't keep the seeds stored for more than 2 years realistically, and even more than 1 year. Viability drops significantly. So when you talk about vegetative reproduction, we're trying some of that. We are doing some grafting. We are collecting nuts. But before that, you have to find the trees. And we have I think several of the speakers, and Lake Grabowski is going to talk about this a lot tomorrow, about locating trees, finding them, how do you log them. And I'm sure he'll talk a lot about tree snap. I hope you guys will all download Tree Snap on your phones, and next time you're out on a hike, log where you find some trees. These are all the current points that people have reported trees. They may not all be American chestnuts. We don't know. Some of them are Chinese chestnuts. We hope that when people take a picture of a tree, they take lots and lots of pictures so that we get lots of different angles. Leaves are super important for us to see in terms of determining whether it's an American or a Chinese, but we really want people to send in a sample as well. That's really the easiest way for us to tell whether a tree is really an American chestnut or not. Through the 35, almost 40 years now that the American Chestnut Foundation has been doing this work, we've collected over about 500, close to 1,000 unique American chestnut backgrounds. And you can see the great majority of them are here in southern Virginia, southwestern Virginia, near the TACF's main research farms in Meadowview. When you log how many there are, almost half of the trees, American chestnuts that we've cataloged and conserved, are all around southwestern Virginia. Now, for diversification of a species, for regional adaptability, that's not going to work. You really need trees from all across the range. And all this shows, I just like the visual of having another picture. You don't really need to study this closely. All this means in the lower right-hand corner is that we need about 1,000 trees, 1,000 Native American chestnuts to properly diversify disease-tolerant chestnuts to avoid things like inbreeding and to have long-term regional adaptability in a restoration population. In Pennsylvania, in New Jersey, you can see we've done a pretty good job of collecting trees and conserving them across the state. We still have some pretty big holes. I would really like folks to focus in the really western 2 counties and basically throughout western PA. And then part of this northeastern tier, Susquehanna County, Sullivan County, Potter County even. These counties there are trees there. They are difficult to find, and that's why we haven't done a really good job of conserving them. You can see that Ridge and Valley Province, any green county, any red county, we've done a pretty good job collecting so far. We don't really need to focus a lot of effort on that. Again, I think Lake is going to cover this a lot more tomorrow. I would love, if any of you are from New Jersey, I would love for people to find some trees in the Pine Barrens. We have not been able to find anything down there. I know there's some in Millville. I've seen those trees, but we haven't collected any nuts from them. So just because there's an open county, that doesn't mean that there's not trees there. It just means that we haven't collected from there and gotten them conserved. So next time you guys are out hiking, consider going to one of these open counties and doing it in the fall so we can collect some material from those areas. Once we collect material, in order to conserve it, we need to plant it somewhere. And so again, our preference is to plant nuts, but we may also do grafts. That's a little bit more difficult, but we won't go into that today. People often poo-poo planting wild type American chestnuts. They say, well, if I plant wild type American chestnuts, they're just going to get the blight and they'll die. And that's true. If you plant American chestnuts, they will get the blight and they will die. But they can also produce just an amazing amount of American chestnuts. They provide excellent habitat for wildlife. This is an American chestnut plantation that was started in 1983. This picture is about 10 years old now, but I've been to this plantation recently, and there's still about 250 American chestnuts there. You can see that none of the original stems are alive. They're all heavily blighted, these really dark areas of bark. That's heavy, heavy blight. These trees look more like bushes. I kind of equate it to like a hazelnut bush. Um, but the amount of deer, turkey, squirrels, you name it, the type of wildlife that you find in this plantation is really amazing. We can collect easily 10,000 nuts from this planting without any problem. And based on planting wild type American chestnuts across Pennsylvania, New York, and other locations, we see about 50% long-term survival of these sprout clumps. So in 1983, Mr. Hahn planted 500 American chestnuts from around Mercer County. That's where this is, Sandy Lake in Mercer County, Pennsylvania. And like I said, today there's about 250 of these sprout clumps still alive. So how do we protect wild trees? We've talked about collecting material and planting them and conserving them ex situ. Well, what about in situ? How do we preserve the current native population in some format? It's not a threatened or endangered tree. There's no protections right now that are afforded to the tree. That said, it's pretty easy to manage the population by clear cuts. You can also protect individual trees by, say, putting a cage around them. Is it really necessary to do that? In most locations, no, especially in most locations in Pennsylvania, because there are just so many sprouts all over the place. But in areas where there are very few sprouts, like if we go back to that map and see, okay, this lower southwestern portion of Pennsylvania where there aren't that many trees, or this extreme northeastern portion of Pennsylvania, or down here in the Pine Barrens where there aren't that many trees, I would encourage people to protect individual trees. Ridge and Valley Province, not so much. we got enough. It probably doesn't warrant going through a lot of effort to protect trees there. What the American Chestnut Foundation does promote, though, is having some big control areas where we don't do anything. We don't plant any material. We don't do any sort of artificial manipulation of the native population. And if you go back to that FAA map from John Scrivani, you see these two areas that we're promoting not doing anything in, like the Shenandoah National Park or the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. There's tons of chestnuts there. We're going to promote not planting anything in these locations or not doing anything artificial. It's about 0.2% of the native range, the equivalent of about 440,000 acres between the two areas. But these will, by not planting there, by not doing anything directly, it would give us a great look to see what the native population does on its own without any sort of intervention. A lot of people have hypothesized, well, maybe the American chestnut will derive resistance on its own. It's highly unlikely, but by not doing anything in these locations, we can observe that over time. We need to talk about habitat suitability. If we collect these materials, if we get resistance, when we get resistance, disease resistance into these materials, where are we going to be able to plant them? If you look here, the dark blue areas are all highly suitable. The dark green areas are all highly suitable. You can see most of Pennsylvania, with the exception of a lot of these glaciated areas in northwestern PA. A lot of the white areas are where it's already been taken over by agriculture. Tons of highly suitable land to plant American chestnuts across Pennsylvania. And that's really where we want to focus planting material from the offset. And we hope eventually to provide a model like this online where a landowner can go and say, is my property suitable for planting American chestnut? Is it not? How much are we going to be able to predict the kind of success and survival rate that someone might have on a given piece of property based on site characteristics? Another reason I bring that up is because this is about how we're going to try and track how we've done restoration. One of the easiest way to do that is maybe break up the range into 7.5-minute quads, like the USGS does, and then say, okay, within each one of these quads, where's the highest suitable land to plant? Each quad is about 37,000 acres. There are 5,744 quadrangles within the natural range of the US. You can see here in that picture, this is the native range from Maine down into Mississippi. And then within each quad, prioritize one or more planting sites that have the highest suitability where we can plant some trees. So let's talk about best management practices. I will say I've planted a lot of trees. I've had a lot of failed plantings. Hardwoods are very difficult to plant and to get artificial regeneration of. We do have some BMPs of what to do and what not to do, but I will say virtually every site needs some sort of individual specifications to follow. This is a planting site outside, it's up on Chestnut Ridge in Westmoreland County, outside of Ligonier. And it's an old, it was a high graded site that had a lot of regenerating black birch and yellow birch coming up on it. It was significantly cut back, left a couple of nice oak seed trees, and then planted underneath and fenced entirely with an 8-foot woven wire deer fence. Some questions that we've asked over the years in these various silvicultural trials: how much shade can American chestnut handle? If you look at this picture, that's a pretty good amount of shade. Chestnuts will handle it. They'll grow faster typically in more open areas than not. And the thing to keep in mind is that chestnuts will only flower in open sun. So that's another thing to consider when you're coming into a planting area. What other species can you plant with chestnut? How many do you plant? How much diversity? Are you going to plant seeds? Are you going to plant seedlings? How much weed control do you need? All of these things are almost entirely site specific when you get down to it, especially this weed control thing. This is so dependent on what your competing species are. If you're planting in an area like this, which is an old forested site, you'll see the stuff that's coming up here. This landowner actually planted a native wildflower mix from Ernst seeds, and that has worked amazingly well. She really didn't have to do hardly any weed control or maintenance for the first few years. Chestnut easily competed with that. But if you plant in the middle of a field with a lot of heavily competing grass, that's going to be really difficult. Chestnut does not compete well with grass, and you're going to have to do some maintenance. Let's talk about invasive species. That's even worse. I have, Hoy is here on this call. He gave a great talk on Tuesday. We constantly fight things like morning glory, bittersweet, mile a minute. These are all just nasty, nasty invaders that you have to keep at bay for a long time. So, your weed control is really going to depend on what kind of things you're fighting against. This picture, this is Doug Jacobs. This is at a planting in Wisconsin. It was a previously forested, clear-cut site. The trees grew amazingly well. It was American chestnut planted alongside red oak. American chestnut by far outgrew red oak, and we find that on virtually every site that American chestnut will outgrow red oak and do very, very well in terms of growth characteristics. This is a site that we have in Stone Valley in Penn State's research forest. Tim Phelps, who's now with the Tennessee chapter, he was with Penn State. He helped install these with Kim Steiner here at PSU to figure out what's the best way, again, to get these trees established. Do we use heavy herbicide? Do we use tree shelters? Do we use fencing? Do we do direct seed? Do we plant seedlings? Do we do bare roots seedlings? Do we do containerized seedlings? On these sites in Stone Valley, which are highly suitable for American chestnut. Chestnut does great on these sites. We actually found that planting seeds didn't differ that much from planting seedlings. You didn't really gain much by planting a seedling over planting seed. You didn't gain much in planting bare root versus containerized. The forests did better than the field sites. And you didn't necessarily have to control the vegetation right out the outset. What I will say about the herbicide treatment in this trial, though, we were a little heavy-handed with the herbicide, and I think that harmed the chestnut. We used a pre-emergent that I think affected the American chestnut growth, so we need to replicate this trial. But you can see here's Hoy here with one of the products of those trials. He's standing right next to an American chestnut stem. You can see that this fiberglass stake next to an American chestnut here. So these trees would have been planted in 2005. This picture was taken in about 2000, was that 17 or 18, Hoy? So, 10, 11, 12 years old, got some pretty nice growth. Here's another American chestnut right here. Growing pretty well. Not a lot of nut production though, because they were planted in a shelter wood. It wasn't fully open. They hadn't quite reached the canopy to do nut production, but they still grew enormously well, got past that dog hair stage and gave some really nice trees. These are wild type Americans, by the way. They have no resistance and they still lived pretty well. Even until now, we've got some pretty nice specimens. Here's some, I love this picture. This is American chestnut, Tom Lasden there, peeking out among the American chestnuts. He's got a measuring pole, height pole right here. The American chestnuts are outcompeting stump sprouting yellow birch. So on a really good site, American chestnut can outcompete stump sprouts of yellow birch, tulip poplar, almost any other species. Now this won't happen on poor sites for American chestnut. The wetter the site, the more clay you have in the soil, chestnut won't grow like this. You need a well-drained acidic soil for chestnut to have this kind of competitive ability, but they can do it. So let's talk about direct seeding. This is a constant debate within the artificial regeneration community. So if we look at this site here on the left, this is Blair Carball's site in Danville, Pennsylvania. This is ideal. I love this kind of manicured site. He has a 3-foot band of herbicide vegetation control along all of his trees. The trees did amazingly well. They grew fantastic. This is sort of what I always hold up as the poster child of how to grow chestnuts. On the right, this was a direct seeding trial where we took 40,000 chestnuts of all various manner and hybrid. We call them chestnuts, so virtually anything you can imagine. We broadcast 40,000 chestnuts across an acre and saw what come up. One trial, this is on State Game Lands 205 out near Orfield or Hamburg, Pennsylvania. Our one trial, they did amazingly well. We got 10% survival of the American chestnuts, or the chestnuts that we planted, and they're still thriving. That was in 2015. I visited it this past fall, and they're still doing great. We still have about 10% survival from that broadcast dispersal. This trial that I'm showing you the picture of, unfortunately, did not do well. I'm showing you the one tree that we could find among all the competing vegetation. And so the take home here from these two trials was, you got to control the vegetation. If you don't, you're not going to get anything. You might think the biggest issue is going to be herbivory or predation. Sure, that's an issue, but even bigger is going to be this vegetation control, because especially if it's grass or a field, the trees can't outcompete the stuff that grows so fast. We have plantings all across the eastern U.S. This is an example of a planting on the Hoosier National Forest. We've got about 4 out in southern Indiana, and based on all these plantings, we've got what's called a testing task force protocol. We've published several planting manuals. We've got a best management practices that was funded by the Sustainable Forestry Initiative. We've got tons of fact sheets. So if you guys are interested in our BMPs for planting, we can provide that for you. You can go to the PA New Jersey website. I have a Penn State website too that we collect all this stuff. These are great places to start. It won't tell you exactly what you need to do on your property, but it'll say what works in most places most of the time. And it'll be a great place to start and kind of branch out from there. Natural regeneration of American chestnut doesn't happen that often these days, obviously. There are a few places that have been pretty well documented. West Salem, Wisconsin is the most well documented. You can find literature all over the place about this site. A farmer from Pennsylvania moved to Wisconsin, planted 9 seeds in the early 1900s, and it developed into 30 acres of chestnut. That's very rare. Roselawn, Indiana, Berlin, Vermont, Orleans, Massachusetts, Atkinson, Maine. These are all much smaller sites. Atkinson is one of the biggest. It's about a 10-acre site, of which a much smaller portion has actual really good regeneration in it. The other sites are only about an acre or 2 in size, where you have actual regeneration happening. If you read the historical literature, if you look at chestnut in Europe and Asia, chestnut doesn't regenerate very well from seed. Most people in the late 1800s and the early 1900s managed American chestnut by coppice, by cutting it and letting it regenerate. Chestnut does amazingly well with that, but it's difficult to get it installed. Here's an example of West Salem. This site, these pictures were taken in the year 2000, so over 20 years ago. Since then, all of these trees have been blighted, and there's hardly anything that's alive now. It looks very different than what these pictures suggest. But this is what chestnut can do in the best site with the best maintenance installed on the best soils. You can see this wolf tree, one of the original trees that were planted. And again, this turned into 30 acres and thousands of trees. Very rare, but a lot to learn here as to what we need to do from a reintroduction standpoint. Steve Rogstatt is a population geneticist at the University of Cincinnati. He's done several papers with his students, himself and his students, to figure out what's the best reintroduction population that we can get by putting these things out into the woods and then modeling them. And he used the West Salem American chestnut stand as data for him to put together that model. And this is a lot of numbers, but basically what you need to see is this 300 individuals in the beginning. That's really the best, what he found in his models for long-term sustainability of a population. You need to start with about 300 individuals at the beginning. That gives you about 170 trees at fruiting age to have a sustainable long-term positive regeneration population that's actually reproducing more trees than it's losing over time. I mean, that's generally my observation. And you'll see here that 300 individuals versus 170. That's what I see. You know, I've been doing this for about 20 years, and almost all of our plantings that have been appropriately installed and maintained, you get about 50% survival long term, and that's what he found in his models as well. This is a picture of the Atkinson site in Maine. We call this part of the site Chestnut City. And the only reason that this part of the site really did well was because there was a cut. There was a harvest of red oak that came in, and that prompted an explosion of chestnut that came in the site. So it also goes to show that you do need some sort of disturbance in order to get restoration of chestnut. The literature bears that as well, and that's what I've seen over time, that in order to get chestnut to regenerate and obviously to flower, you need some sort of disturbance event for that. Let's talk about seed and seedling production. On the right is Valonia Nursery in southern Indiana. I always say it's not fair, the kind of soil. I don't know if there are any rocks in Indiana, but there certainly aren't at the Valonia Nursery. That soil goes forever into the ground. It's beautiful to grow in. They grow 7-foot tall seedlings in 1 year at this nursery. They're just gorgeous. On the left is our seedlings that Hoy has grown in the Penn State greenhouse. So you can see, and I just want to point out these numbers here in the lower left-hand corner. We have a lot of goals and objectives related to seed and seedling production. Restoration is going to come down to how much seed and how many seedlings we can produce and get out into the forest. I'm going to throw a lot of numbers at you. So I will kind of say, take home point. So bear with me, and if you have any questions about these numbers, we can talk about it at the end. So seedling production in the U.S., 1.2 billion seedlings are planted on average every year on 2.5 million acres in the U.S. That's the entire U.S. 82% of that is in the South. 75% of that is bare rootstock, not containerized. I bet you can guess what species most of that is. It's loblolly pine because that's a highly commercial valuable species. This picture is taken at Penn Nursery, just outside of State College here in central Pennsylvania. Penn Nursery has been a great, and DCNR, of course. I'll give another shout out to the Game Commission as well, but I just have this picture of Penn Nursery. They help us grow a lot of seedlings for outplanting and a lot of these silvicultural and restoration trials. I digress. So 1.2 billion seedlings, 82% in the South. Great majority of that is loblolly pine, maybe some Doug fir. It's virtually all conifer. So 5% of those 1.2 billions are hardwood. That's so small, but it also goes to show you how hardwood seedlings aren't that difficult to grow, but they are so hard to get installed and regenerating and grown in the forest. I'm sure many of you have planted oaks and tulip poplars and probably sugar maple. Hardwoods are very difficult to regenerate, and I think this number really gets to that. Only 5% of U.S. seedling production is hardwood seedlings. So that's 22 million trees, about 43,000 acres are planted in hardwood every year. 67% of hardwoods are oaks. That's not too surprising. 1% is tulip poplar. So that's all oaks. That's red oak, bur oak, white oak, probably sawtooth oak. A lot of people love planting sawtooth oak. So when I started to say, the title of this is, silvicultural perspectives, and I also like to call it the magnitude of restoration. What is it going to take to get this tree out into the forest? I love this picture. This is Michael French's truck, just filled with seedlings. These are all from Penn Nursery. I think these are from Penn Nursery. But so just trying to get these trees drove around to where they're going to live. It's actually a lot easier to bring a bag of chestnut seeds. I'm a big proponent of direct seeding. So I digress again. So let's go back to this number. So let's assume that 1% of current seedling production, that tulip poplar number, is what we're going to use for chestnut production. So that's 220,000 trees a year. Right now, the American Chestnut Foundation, the most seedlings per year that it's grown in the past 40 years is 75,000 seedlings. So that's a far cry from 220,000, but let's just use that number as a goal for us to look at. So if you plant 220,000 trees a year using Steve Rogstatt's model of having to plant 300 trees in a given location for good restoration practices, how long is it going to take you to plant 1% of the range? That's about 1 million acres. It'll take you, well, spoiler alert, it'll take you over 2,000 years to do that. So if you're planting almost 250,000 trees every year, it's going to take you 2,000 years to just even scratch the surface of the native range of the American chestnut. So let's say you're able to plant 17,000 acres in a given year. Well, then it'll only take you 39 years, but that's going to mean you plant so many more trees. It's probably not even feasible to plant that many trees. So the magnitude of restoration is going to take you anywhere between 1 and 2,000 years, depending on how many trees you plant. But I kind of want to go back to this number of, people kind of laugh at that and say, well, and maybe cry, I don't know, but about how much it's going to take to get these things in the ground. It is possible for us probably to create maybe 1 million seedlings a year, but it's going to take a long time for us to ramp up to that production. So whenever someone asks me, how long is restoration going to take? Or when are we going to get the species restored? Or when can I have a seedling even? I always kind of go back to these numbers to say it's really going to be dependent on us really ramping up production. If we can only provide 75,000 seeds per year, that's not going to cut it. I've done run a few models on our current production numbers, and it looks like at most, if we had the best bumper crop and we could collect everything, harvest everything on all our trees, we could get about 5 million seeds a year. And let's say half of those survive seedling production. That's about 2.5 million seedlings a year. I think that's actually probably more accurate. So, restoration at that level will be a little bit more reasonable than 2,000 years. But I think regardless, however you slice this, restoration is a decades, if not centuries long enterprise that's going to take a long time and a lot of people planting a lot of trees. Let's go to something boring, which is how do we track all this? Not only do we have to get the trees in the ground, we have to figure out where have we planted them? Have we I talked a little bit about that quad system where we say, well, let's break out the range into these quads, and so we can track where the best sites are and how many we've planted. We've got we spent too much money. We spent a lot of money on a customized online software called dentata base. We're still developing it, but this is how we're tracking all of our plantings, all of our breeding, all of our plantings. Some people have contacted me and being concerned about how we'll track transgenic plantings. How do we know where they went? What happens if something isn't safe with that? It's safe, by the way, but in case something happens, we can track all that because we do track all of our plantings, almost all of our plantings. We'll definitely track all of our transgenic trees, but we track them in dentata base. We track the breeding of them, we track all the seed production, we track distribution, and we track where they get planted. And we're in this next phase of development, we're trying to make it a little bit easier for people to use it for their own plantings. So we hope in the next year or two, this will be the go-to place to track the trees that you've planted. once you get a tree in the ground, you got to get it to live, and you also have to get it to disperse by some sort of means. This is a cool picture I took in the Atkinson site in Maine. You can see each one of these orange flags is a little seedling, a 1-year seedling. And this was done by red squirrels. Red squirrels are the primary dispersal agent in Atkinson, Maine. I mean, it's really cool to find their cache of seeds, especially when they forget. And you can see the seedlings that came up from their cache. Critters will definitely move seeds. Here's a paper, Sewa et al. He looked at wood mouse dispersal of Japanese chestnuts. West Salem, again, that West Salem, Wisconsin site shows that you find most seedlings established about a half a kilometer from a given tree, and that's generally what we find. And we also have a current grant given to a researcher at Ohio State who's looking at blue jay dispersal. Now that surely will increase the range of dispersal over a red squirrel, for example, but we really don't have any information on how far a blue jay will send seeds and what its preferences are in terms of nut size or style. Bad news, we've got lots of hurdles. You guys probably all know this. I bet a lot of you have planted hardwoods, maybe even chestnuts, but deer are going to be one of the biggest things for us to overcome in terms of getting these things established and growing. We've got tons of invasive competitors. Stiltcress, multiflora rose, mile a minute is just awful. There are other diseases and pests that we need to worry about. Phytophthora Cinnamomi is ink rot disease. That's moving north. It is in Pennsylvania. Sudden oak death, luckily, I'm going to knock on wood, is not in Pennsylvania that we know of. And we got spotted lanternfly to worry about now. We are going to have more and more of these diseases and pests, and even invasive vegetative competition that we're going to have to worry about. And then we've got 180 million acres that we need to worry about in terms of the original range to get this planted. So we talked about how we're going to prioritize that, how much we plant. All of these are going into our restoration strategies. Some chestnut habitat is highly suitable, but not suitable for planting. So here's an American chestnut on the right growing. We call this the rock dump tree, but this is perfect habitat for American chestnut. I don't know if we're going to be able to plant there. It's really hard. That said, Allegheny wood rats love American chestnuts. Hoy has done some supplemental feeding with Allegheny wood rats in environments like this, but it's going to be really hard to do reintroduction plantings on sites like this. And you all know Pennsylvania has a lot of sites like this. I want to end, this is E.O. Wilson. I hope you guys all know he's a phenomenal naturalist, but I love what he has to say about American chestnut. So if you'll bear with me about a minute, I'm going to wrap up with E.O. Wilson sharing some of his thoughts about restoration of American chestnut.
We might think of the chestnut as iconic, as extra important. Probably it was, just in sheer influence that it had on the ecosystems that it dominated. The destruction of the American chestnut is certainly an ecological disaster. When I first heard about the Chestnut Project, I thought that was just a great idea. It was inspiriting. Let's bring the species back from extinction. Species by species is how we're going to save life on this earth, and we're going to do it. Success rewarding this tremendous effort is going to have a joyous reception because we can bring the great chestnut forest back.
All right. Well, thank you guys. I think hopefully we might have a couple minutes for questions. There's my email address. That is not me on the right. That's Kendra Collins. That I call that the Kendra pose. That's the Berlin chestnut in Berlin, Vermont. And over on the left is the Atkinson site in Maine. But Sara at ACF is my email address. And I don't know, Jim, any questions?
Well, there's plenty of questions.
Yeah, okay.
A lot coming our way. Let's take a break and then we'll get right into it. If any of our listeners would like to join us at the American Chestnut Foundation, go to www.acf.org and click on the membership tab. Members receive our monthly newsletter, TACF's Chestnut magazine 3 times a year, invitations to our spring growers and fall meetings in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, volunteer opportunities, and access to chestnut seeds, weather and growing conditions permitting. Plus, you get to meet many great people who are pursuing something really larger than themselves, and that will span several generations. This year, our chapter has thrown in an additional incentive. Any new members who join the Pennsylvania, New Jersey chapter in January will automatically be entered in a drawing to win 6 pints of ice cream of your choice from the beloved Penn State Berkey Creamery. Creamery is located about 2 minutes from our headquarters office at Penn State and 10 minutes from our chestnut orchard. And when people visit with us, they usually find their way over to the creamery. So let's take a look at the questions you're asking, and we'll get to as many as we can. Sara, I just wanted to ask a clarifying question. What is a Cade germplasm? Very, very intimidating term, I must say.
Yeah, sorry about that. Cade is Castanea dentata, C-A-D-E. So Cade, if you look at forestry, a lot of them will abbreviate a species name with the first 2 letters of the scientific name and the first 2 letters of the last. So red oak is often Q-U-R-U, Cruru, because Quercus rubra. So Cade is just Castanea dentata, C-A-D-E.
And what about that word germplasm? Tell me about that.
Germplasm is any part of the tree, really. And so in this case, it's any part of the tree that we can conserve. Most notably nuts, but also it can be scionwood because we can graft that, or embryos because you can put that into tissue culture. So it's just a catch-all term for plant tissue that you can regenerate in some way.
Okay, got it. I just want to ask this question about the 2,000-year process. Does that include regeneration in those calculations?
No, that's just planting.
Oh, wow, what a relief. Okay, that'll help a lot.
That's assuming that they all live, in those sites, which they will not. I think what people need to be prepared for is, that 50% number. When I say, we get about 50% survival long-term of plantings, that's when they're established and you get survival to about age 5. Then you get 50% survival from there. Our plantings, especially outplantings in the woods, we see about 30% survival of all plantings, of all outplantings. So I think people need to prepare for failure in some cases and be prepared to replant, because it happens a lot in hardwood regeneration.
Okay, I just have to ask this one other question. It's not a small question, but we'll keep it tight. Climate change, what's that going to do to Pennsylvania, New Jersey, our area in terms of the impact on reestablishing chestnut?
I think for the foreseeable future, Pennsylvania and New Jersey will both be suitable for American chestnut habitat.
Right.
I think what we're doing in the Chestnut Foundation, one thing I didn't mention in this talk is that a majority of diversity of the species of American chestnut is in the Southern Appalachians, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, North Carolina. You have lots of diversity down there. So because you have so much diversity down there and because of climate change, the American Chestnut Foundation is working to do a little bit, not hardcore, but a little bit of assisted migration, where we're taking material from the South, moving it up north so that it can be better adapted for long-term suitability. And, we do plant material in Pennsylvania, from Pennsylvania in Pennsylvania, but I think we're going to have to incorporate and plant together material from further south for long-term suitability.
Okay, got it. All right, I don't want to step on tomorrow's presentation by Lake Grabowski, but the question's asked, what should we collect for a sample when we find an American chestnut?
Great
Leaves,
question.
twigs, flowers, fruit.
Yeah, so fruit is the least important. It's very difficult to tell species just by a nut or a burr. We can do it with some reasonableness, but if you do a nut and a burr, try to include that in with, the most important is a twig with leaves attached and from a sunny part of the tree. And I know that's a tall order, and that could also be a pun, but finding a sunny leaf twig with leaves still attached is the best thing. And then press that between paperboard or cardboard, get it flat. That's the best thing. That said, I can work with other stuff. It's just harder for me to do ID if it's not that sort of perfect sample.
If I don't press it, what happens?
It curls up and gets all crunchy and then sometimes disintegrates in transit.
Okay, got it. Amanda asked a question. I have some living chestnuts in Susquehanna County. Is there a need for their genetics? They pop up every few years, get to 2 to 3 DBH and die back.
Yes, we do not yet have anything conserved in Susquehanna County. And in fact, I don't know if you can shoot me an email because I would love to get scion from those trees. Basically, scion is just collecting this much length of the youngest growth of the tree and shipping it. And then Hoy, who I don't know if you can see, he's one of these presenters, Hoy will graft that. We'll also get Jim McKenna at Purdue to graft that so we can try and get that incorporated into our program. We don't currently have any representation from Susquehanna County, so I'd love to see that.
Okay, great question, Amanda. Michael asks, do the nuts from blight infected wild chestnuts already contain the blight, or does the tree pick it up as it goes?
Good question. Very rarely the nuts may have the blight. It's picked up from the air, not from the tree that it comes from, if that makes sense. So just because a wild type tree has the blight, that doesn't mean that it's giving it to its kids. It's nuts. The nuts very rarely get blight on them, but you can tell it's a very distinct orange pustulation that happens on the nuts. And I'd say we see that on 1% or less of the nuts that we get. It can happen, but it's rare. The blight is airborne and also rainborne. It also gets transported by critters. But the longer a tree is exposed to the elements, the longer a tree is exposed to the blight, the more likely it is to get infected and get the blight. So as a seed, it hasn't been exposed very long, so it's less likely to have a blight versus an older tree, which has been out there, battling for a long time, trying not to get exposed.
I've always been fascinated because the blight lives on things like oak trees, but doesn't affect them. But it's there, it's in the woods, and it finds a chestnut as soon as it can.
Yes.
Teresa asks, Teresa asked, I joined the meeting late. Is the contact information provided on how to find out if our land is suitable for planting? There are 2 trees there that are producing seeds but dying.
So we don't yet have a great tool for people to look at their suitability for planting chestnuts. So we are hoping to create that tool in the next year or 2. We're hoping it's like an online mapping thing that people can go in and put it in. For now, what I'll tell you is well-drained, highly permeable, sand is the best, clay is the worst. Acidic, so about a pH of 5.5 is really what we're looking for in terms of chestnut suitability. That's the best chestnut site. The worst is clay or something that retains a lot of water.
Okay. I noticed a lot of those sites seem flat. There were some that went on a high slope. Do you have a preference of slope versus flat?
Flat because it's easy to plant and maintain. The trees will often do better on a slope, but I mean, you do have to balance being able to install and maintain for 5+ years,
right,
versus the best site. So that is a trade-off, or isn't always, but can be a trade-off.
All right. Elizabeth asks, what favorable insect population have we lost in losing the American chestnut?
We don't know for 100% because there weren't great records of insect populations when chestnuts were around. What we do know is that we have seen populations thought extinct or extirpated return now that lots of people are planting more chestnuts. So for example, there was a great Facebook post last year from the Patuxent Wildlife Reserve in Maryland, where they found a long thought extinct chestnut bee started visiting sites that had been planted out there. So I think that what we'll find is more and more we'll find these species that were thought to be extinct or long gone revisited, that have been, marginalized to very small populations, that they're not noticed because, you're not really observing them in large populations of American chestnut. But I have a feeling we'll see more and more reinvigorated populations of these things as more and more chestnuts pop up.
Okay. John asks, would it help finding surviving chestnuts by randomly clear cutting 1/4 acre plots on state forest land with approval, obviously, on probable former chestnut suitable sites?
I mean, sure, that's how we often find lots of chestnuts I don't know that we have to do that systematically. I think that we have a really good working relationship with TCNR, the Game Commission, a lot of these really large forest landowners that often do salvage cuts or do clear cuts, and they'll report to us when they find trees. And these clear cuts are phenomenal for finding fruiting trees, because at age 5 to 10, you get thousands and thousands of chestnuts being produced. And that's how a lot of the Pennsylvania, New Jersey chapter has conserved trees. Jefferson County, Adams County, Franklin County, Clear Creek State Forest, Michaud State Forest, up at Snowshoe. These areas were all clear cut, told to us by DCNR, and then followed by staff who then sent nuts in. So I think, yes, I don't know that it's necessary to do some active pushing to do that, but maybe private landowners in areas where, there isn't DCNR land. I can see that would actually be of greater interest, because that's where we have less representation.
Got it. Asanta asks, have you worked with landscape gardener or gardening associations in order to have more eyes in the search and in the volunteer target market?
I haven't personally. My husband is now, I guess he's still a landscape architect. He recently switched careers, but I know he's done, and Tracy Coulter of the Pennsylvania, New Jersey chapter, they've both done presentations to the landscape community, the landscape architect community, and gardeners. I don't know that we've done as much as we could.
Okay.
There's certainly more outreach that could always be done. We've started, and there's been interest, but if folks want to do outreach, check out Lake's presentation tomorrow. I think that's going to be excellent, an excellent tool for folks to talk to people about finding trees while they're out. We also have other tools, but absolutely, I think that's a good idea. Okay,
one more. And thank you, audience, for great questions. Really appreciate it. It makes a huge difference for us.
Yeah.
Michael asks, is there an estimated distance out from a blight infected tree that the blight can disperse to infect other trees?
Really far. So trees, sort of ground zero, if you will, is the eastern U.S. That's it was imported into Philly, into New York, into those ports in the 1800s, and spread from there. So any place on the East Coast, you're going to get infected pretty early on. The Midwest takes a lot longer for the blight to get to, but we see trees. The West Salem stand eventually got infected. Iowa, Missouri, they eventually get infected. Most of that is probably from people visiting and bringing the blight in. We have not seen, I'm going to knock on wood again for the second time in this talk, we have not seen it proliferate on the West Coast. There are tons of American and European chestnuts in Oregon, Washington, and California. We have not seen blight proliferate. It does not appear to have gotten there either on its own or by human intervention. So Utah, California, however far that is from Pennsylvania. But I think that's more of a climate. It could be more a combination of climate and distance. But in the East Coast, there's really no hope of you escaping the blight. Death taxes and chestnut blight, it's just going to happen.
Which is why we're in search of a solution.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. Okay, we've reached the end of today's session. Thank you so much, Sara, for sharing your insight, experience. I love the maps, and for leading the restoration program.
Sure. Thanks, Jim.
We have 2 more sessions this week. Tonight at 7 p.m., we'll be interviewing Chestnut Growers of America's president, Roger Blackwell, at 7 p.m. And I know that's late for some of you, but we had a really good session last Tuesday. Roger runs a cooperative that's building a national market for culinary chestnuts. And then on Friday at noon, as Sara mentioned, we'll wrap up with Lake Grabowski discussing finding American chestnuts in the wild. Any of you who hike the Appalachian Trail or roam around in your own woodlands may be in for a surprise one day And Lake will open you up to some new possibilities and what to do if you find one. So on behalf of the Pennsylvania, New Jersey chapter of the American Chestnut Foundation, we thank our members and all of you for joining us today. More information on our chapter is at www.panjtacf.org. And we hope you will consider joining with us to save and restore the American chestnut. Good day.